The winter of 1821 put a thin frost on the Kentucky pasture when the Douglas wagon stopped beside a chapel that had outlived its people. The first sounds they brought were nails pried from old pews and driven again into new walls. They raised a house with thrift that looked like virtue, timber taken from the nave, boards smelling of hymn smoke and damp. To the eye it was good stewardship, a family saving what could be saved. To the land it was a quiet trade, holy wood pressed into common rooms. Neighbors came with kettles, salt pork, and the curiosity that follows a new name on a sparse road. They saw Thomas Douglas, tall and mild, with a farmer's hands and a bookkeeper's stare. They saw Margaret with a bonnet tied neat and a voice soft enough to hush a crying calf. They heard that the chapel had failed for lack of tithes and a plague that emptied pews in a week. They liked that the Douglases spoke of gratitude and work. They liked that Thomas looked at the sky before he answered a question as if asking leave from someone higher. They liked that Margaret kept her sleeves rolled down even while hauling water. The family knelt in the grass on their first night and thanked God for a home they had built from a house of God. By morning the place already felt practiced. The ladder leaned where it would always lean. The door closed without a rattle. Even the hens kept to the line of fence like parishioners. The neighbors noticed that it was quiet and called it discipline. They did not ask why the new porch boards gave back the faint taste of incense when the rain rose. They did not ask why Margaret rinsed buckets with well water before milk ever touched them. She said cleanliness is next to godliness, and no one argued with a woman who said grace with dry eyes. If a child from the next farm cried at night, Thomas would pause at his gate and listen, then turn home without a word. The chapel stood half ruin and half barn, its bell gone but its bones firm. The Douglases stacked seed under the altar rail and hung harness where choir robes once swayed. They kept the apse swept and the nave free of mice, and no one could say that was wrong. On Sundays, when others rode to a small church 2 valleys over, Thomas and Margaret walked to their own threshold and bowed their heads in the open door. Some called it private devotion, some called it pride, but the land did not argue. It held the house and the chapel like 2 breaths held in the same chest. When wind bent the sycamores, both roofs answered with the same low hum. At dusk, the homestead arranged itself with an order that did not feel new. Tools were lined by size, rope was coiled to perfect rings. Ashes under the cookstove were leveled flat with the back of a spoon. A visitor might think this neatness meant safety, it meant memory. Each habit belonged to something that had already happened and would happen again. Thomas kept a ledger on a shelf high above reach. In it he made lists that looked like seed counts and ration marks. He marked not only the days but the hours between chores, the minutes a pot took to boil, the time it took for smoke to clear from the hearth. He wrote down the weight of silence after each bell-less dusk. He liked the chapel because it taught him small measures. The nave had once divided voices by rank and duty, and he kept that division in his mind. He sorted tasks by who should carry them and who should not. Margaret kept keys on a ribbon under her dress and moved like a person keeping a promise. She washed the same step twice and never once looked toward the woods where the road curved out of sight. Her eyes held a patient brightness that people named faith. Her hands were careful with every jar and hinge. The house waited, and the silence learned their name. Margaret Douglas carried herself like a woman of grace, a mother cloaked in gentleness, but beneath that calm exterior lived a will that bent every breath in her home toward obedience. To neighbors, she was the kind of woman who held her Bible close, who lowered her eyes in modesty, who spoke with a softness that suggested she lived only to serve. Yet inside the walls of the Douglas homestead, her piety was no longer gentle. It was sharpened into a blade, ritualistic and consuming, a doctrine not of salvation but of control. She believed that children were born tainted, each breath heavy with unseen sin, and that it was her duty to carve out every imperfection before the devil could claim them. What looked like motherly care was, in truth, a campaign of torment dressed as devotion. Each night, when the house grew still and the fields were swallowed by darkness, Margaret gathered her children on the wooden floor. They knelt in rows like penitents, their small bodies trembling as she placed their hands together in prayer. The ritual did not end with simple words. She demanded silence so complete that even breathing felt like rebellion. The children's knees pressed into boards she had scattered with maize kernels, sharp and unyielding, grinding into their skin until blood seeped through nightgowns. Margaret watched without flinching. To her, the sight of wounds meant progress, proof that sin was being scoured away. She whispered prayers that began with scripture but ended in distorted phrases. Half hymn, half command, incantations that sounded less like devotion to God and more like invocations to bend the will of her children. When one faltered, she pressed her hand against the back of their head, forcing their forehead into the boards until the prayer returned to their lips. What outsiders mistook for discipline was in truth obsession. Margaret created cycles of ritual that her children could not escape. Mornings began with a wash that was not meant to clean but to purify. She carried a basin of water laced with ash, not ordinary ash but bone ash she had crushed herself. No one knew where she collected the fragments. Some whispered it came from the chapel ruins. Others feared it was from creatures burned in secret. She mixed the powder into the water, gray and gritty, and claimed that each infant's skin must be soaked in it, every drop seeping into their pores to drive out the darkness that lived within. Baptism, she insisted, was not a one-time ceremony. It had to be repeated endlessly. The ash a shield against corruption. The infants whimpered in her arms as she lowered them into the mixture. Their lips turned pale, their limbs weak, but Margaret called it the weight of sin leaving them. When they cried, she pressed her finger to their mouths, silencing them with the warning that demons listened through tears. Each ritual left them frailer, their bodies shrinking, their eyes wide with fear they did not yet have words for. She carried them back to their beds with the serenity of a saint, as though exhaustion and sickness were holy signs of her success. To her mind, illness was purification. Weakness was a blessing. Her control did not stop with the children. She bound herself to constant acts of self-denial, but even these sacrifices were calculated. She starved herself of bread not out of humility, but to test whether her children would break faster when they saw her endure hunger without complaint. She wore heavy garments in the heat, her body sweating under layers of wool so that her children would feel shame for seeking comfort. At night she whispered scripture in the dark, not to God but into the ears of her sleeping family, embedding words of guilt and damnation so deep that even their dreams bent to her will. Thomas the father watched quietly from the edges, recording each ritual in his ledger. He did not interfere. Margaret's methods fed his own obsession with measurement and record. He allowed her to break the children because he wanted to study the breaking. Together, they created a rhythm of cruelty, disguised as holiness, that repeated with the inevitability of the seasons. The children learned to fear the hours when the house fell still, when Margaret's voice grew soft and deliberate, when the bowl of ash water was carried to the center of the room. They learned to accept the sting of maize kernels digging into their flesh as normal, to think of their own pain as prayer. Each scar was explained to them as proof that they were chosen, but in truth the scars were simply evidence of Margaret's need to control every fragment of their existence. The children's small bodies became the canvas on which her obsession wrote itself, line by line, bruise by bruise. To the outside world, Margaret Douglas remained a figure of respect. She attended gatherings with a face that never betrayed fatigue, never hinted at cruelty. When neighbors complimented her children's quietness, she smiled as though it were praise, when in truth it was silence bred by fear. She had learned how to hide her rituals behind the mask of godliness, how to make suffering look like discipline, and how to keep questions at bay with a calm voice and lowered eyes. Inside the homestead, however, her reign of ritual never paused. The walls absorbed the echoes of prayers twisted into demands. The wooden boards carried the stain of blood pressed from small knees. The air carried the faint odor of ash that clung to the skin of every child who passed through her arms. And in Margaret's mind, every mark of suffering was a triumph, every shiver a sign that her mission was succeeding. She did not see herself as cruel. She saw herself as chosen, as the hand that would carve holiness into her family, no matter how much it bled. And so the house of the Douglases did not rest. It lived and breathed Margaret's rituals by the nightly rhythm of pain cloaked as prayer, by the slow unraveling of children who learned to fear both silence and the sound of their mother's voice. The world beyond the fence saw only piety, but within Margaret's devotion tightened like a noose, preparing the stage for horrors yet to come. Thomas Douglas lived behind the mask of meekness, a man neighbors trusted because he spoke little and bowed his head often. To the community he was a farmer with patient eyes and a steady gait, a husband who let his wife lead the talk of faith. He smiled faintly when others greeted him, his silence mistaken for humility. But inside the homestead, when the doors were locked and the lantern burned low, Thomas revealed the truth of his nature. He was not a man of God or of soil. He was a collector, an observer of suffering, and his devotion was to the records he kept in his study. The study smelled of ink, iron, and oil. It was a small room lined with shelves of seed jars and farm ledgers, a place no visitor would find remarkable. Yet hidden within was a book unlike any other, a thick leather-bound ledger, its pages weighted with the darkness of his purpose. He had carved the binding himself, stitched the spine tight so it would not betray its contents if ever left in sight. This ledger was not filled with crop counts or debts owed. It was filled with the anatomy of his own children. Every page bore sketches of infant limbs, rib cages drawn with a precision that spoke of long-studied attention. He mapped their veins, recorded the spacing of their ribs, and marked how their bodies bent under strain. His pen moved with care, not the haste of a farmer, but the calm of a scientist. Each entry was dated, timed, and detailed beyond measure. He noted the weight of a child at dawn and again at dusk, recording each ounce lost as food was withheld. He measured the length of each breath when a child cried in pain, counting heartbeats by pressing his ear against frail chests, his hand steady with quill even as their bodies trembled beneath him. The ledger became a scripture of cruelty, a diary of what he believed was sacred purification. To Thomas, suffering was not tragedy, it was data. He oversaw his children's starvation as though it were a holy trial. Bread was portioned into crumbs, milk into drops, each reduction recorded with cold precision. When their stomachs swelled from hunger, he drew the outline of the distended belly in his book, marking how long the swelling lasted before the body gave way to collapse. He studied fevers with the same attention a physician might give to cures, but he sought no remedy. He wanted only to know how long the body endured before the will broke. He called it a test of flesh and faith, but in truth it was the study of decay dressed in scripture. Thomas spoke little during these rituals. His silence was his authority. He did not lash out in anger or raise his voice. Instead, he enforced his will by the weight of observation. The children felt his gaze on them as heavily as chains, knowing that every whimper, every faltering breath was being written into a book that decided their worth. His calm presence made their pain feel inevitable, as though their suffering were not punishment but simply the order of the world. He sat by the bedside of the weakest child, watching the rise and fall of their chest, writing with patience as the breaths grew shallow then still. He did not cry or tremble when death arrived. He marked the hour in his ledger, drew a line beneath the entry, and closed the book with the same composure he showed in church. The ledger itself grew heavier with each child lost. Pages stiffened with ink and oil, with small stains that looked too dark to be from a pen alone. He studied the records again and again, comparing one death to another, searching for patterns, for consistencies, for what he called purity of method. Margaret's rituals fed into his pages, her ash baptisms and punishments providing variables for his observations. Together their cruelty formed a cycle, her devotion breaking the body, his ledger capturing its failure. In public, Thomas carried none of this weight on his face. He appeared as a quiet man who allowed his wife to guide the household's piety. Neighbors respected him for his patience, his willingness to listen, his habit of stepping back when others quarreled. They never saw the ink on his fingertips or the way his eyes lingered too long on children, not his own, as though already measuring them in silence. His meekness was his disguise, the still water beneath which lay the machinery of a calculating mind. At night, when the house fell silent, Thomas returned to his ledger, flipping back through years of suffering. He traced patterns with his finger, whispering to himself about endurance, decay, and the triumph of control. The book became his gospel, and each child's death was not loss but proof that his work was succeeding. He believed he was writing a sacred text, one that measured the distance between flesh and spirit, one that would stand as evidence that he had tamed the corruption of human weakness. In his mind, he was not a father of grief, but a keeper of truth. The study grew thick with the presence of his obsession. The walls carried the smell of ink and decay, the floor creaked under the weight of his chair, and the air felt heavy with silence, broken only by the scratching of his quill. No one but Thomas knew the full extent of what the ledger held, yet its shadow extended into every corner of the house. Each child feared not only the punishments of their mother, but the gaze of their father, knowing that their pain was being immortalized in a book that would outlive them. Their small lives became entries, their death lines of ink, their existence reduced to the turning of pages. In Thomas's hands, the ledger was more than a record, it was a covenant. And as long as it remained unburned, unburied, the cycle of flesh and faith would continue, marking each child not as a soul to be loved, but as an experiment to be concluded. The meek father in public was the keeper of a scripture written in suffering, a man who turned life into data and death into order. And in the silence of his study, he prepared for the next entry, knowing the book was far from finished. The Douglas children were born into silence and kept there. To the neighbors, they were ghosts, glimpsed only in the crook of a mother's arm on Sundays, seen less and less with each passing year. A child might be carried to the fence line once, eyes wide and searching. But the next season that child was gone, swallowed by the house that never opened its doors wide. People said the children were delicate, easily sickened, or that Margaret was too protective to let them wander. But gossip did not reach the truth. The truth lived below the floorboards, in a cellar where air was thick with damp and light was rationed like a punishment. The cellar was no ordinary space. Its walls sweated with cold and its stone floor breathed a chill that never lifted. A narrow slit of a window was blackened with rags, admitting only a faint line of gray. The air smelled of mildew, but what struck hardest was the silence. Margaret enforced it with a discipline that turned the children's voices into forbidden things. To speak above a whisper was to invite her hand against their mouth. To cry was to summon the belt. To scream was to feel the sting of salt pressed into cuts. The children learned quickly that silence was survival, and so they lived in a hush that made them soundless even in their own minds. Their bodies bore the marks of confinement. Limbs that should have grown strong from play grew thin and stiff from crouching in the dark. Bones strained under the weight of malnutrition. Joints swelled and ribs pressed outward against fragile skin. Their heads hung heavy, and when they stood, it was with the trembling of bodies too weak to carry themselves. To Margaret and Thomas, this was not tragedy but proof. They believed growth was not a gift, but a corruption, that to remain small and fragile was to remain pure. So when the children failed to grow, the parents smiled as though their work was blessed. The cruelty of their rituals was given form in the masks. Each child was forced to wear one during the baptisms, masks carved by Thomas from scraps of wood salvaged from the chapel beams. They were rough, with sharp edges that dug into cheeks, with straps of leather that cut into tender flesh. Holes were cut for breathing, but only small ones so that each inhalation was shallow, each exhale damp against the wood. Margaret placed them over the children's faces, not to protect them, but to erase them. The mask made them nameless, faceless objects to be purified rather than souls to be loved. When the leather straps tore into skin, when sores bloomed beneath the wood, she said it was the mark of holiness. The baptisms themselves were acts of suffocation disguised as salvation. Children were held down while Margaret poured her gray ash water across their faces, the mixture filling the mask, choking them as they gasped. Their bodies writhed, their fingers clawing at the straps, but Thomas recorded each spasm, each desperate movement, as if he were witnessing scripture unfold. When the water finally drained and the child sagged, weak and shivering, Margaret called it cleansing. The mask remained in place long after the ritual, so that the child's face became less their own and more the shape of wood and pain. Over time, the masks no longer seemed foreign to them. The children came to accept them as part of their identity, as if the straps and edges defined their existence. In the dark, they did not see one another as siblings, but as shifting silhouettes, faceless figures breathing through narrow holes. They recognized each other by sound and by the faint scent of blood and ash, not by smiles or features. Even their dreams became faceless, built on fragments of fear rather than images of freedom. The neighbors wondered why laughter never came from the Douglas yard, why no toys lay scattered in the grass. They excused it with stories of sickness or strictness, but unease lingered. Still, no one asked and no one looked too closely. The Douglases had built their life on that silence, and the children bore its cost. They grew not upward into the world, but downward into shadows, their bodies and voices stripped away piece by piece until they remained only as hollow vessels bound by ritual. In the cellar, time stretched without measure. Days bled into nights, seasons shifted above, but the children did not change. Their bodies remained small, their voices faint, their eyes wide beneath the weight of masks. They did not grow, because growth was forbidden. They did not live, because life was not granted. They existed as echoes of themselves, shaped by the hands of parents who believed cruelty was holy and silence was godliness. And so the Douglas children became the infants who did not grow, baptized again and again, faceless and nameless, their identities erased by wood and ash. Outside, the house looked quiet and devout, a place of discipline and faith. But beneath the floorboards, innocence was not nurtured but consumed, and childhood was a thing deliberately extinguished in the name of salvation. Margaret Douglas believed that flesh itself was the enemy, that the skin of every infant was a sheath for corruption, and only through pain could it be scoured clean. To her, the body was a vessel crawling with hidden rot, and the voice of a crying child was not the sound of innocence, but the shriek of evil being forced out. She carried this belief with the solemnity of faith, repeating it until it became the law of her house. The rituals she built were not accidents of cruelty, but careful designs, repeated again and again until suffering itself became her language of prayer. The cellar floor bore witness to her most feared invention. She dragged in thick planks of wood and spread them with layers of coarse salt, not poured loose but pressed into the boards with water until the grains clung like glass. These boards became her altar, and her children were the offerings. She stripped the infants of their clothing, their small bodies left bare to the damp air, and laid them down across the salt. Their skin, soft and unguarded, sank into the crusted surface, and almost instantly the screams began. To Margaret, those screams were music. She called them the devil's voice leaving the body, the flesh expelling darkness through pain. The longer the child writhed, the more convinced she became that the ritual was working. When the skin reddened and split, when blisters rose and bled against the sharp grains, she pressed their bodies harder into the boards, whispering her warped blessings over their suffering. Her hands were steady, her eyes fixed as though she saw not wounds but revelations. She told herself she was saving them, that each cry was a proof of victory, that pain was not cruelty but the only road to purity. Thomas stood nearby, never intervening, always recording. He timed each scream, counted the minutes before exhaustion overtook the body, measured the depth of rawness left on the flesh. His ledger grew heavy with notes. How long it took before blood appeared. How the heart stuttered beneath stress. How silence finally fell when a child could no longer fight against the salt. To him, every sound was data, every wound a measurement, every scar an entry in a controlled experiment. He did not soothe or stop Margaret. Instead, he studied her ritual like a man observing fire, fascinated not by its cruelty but by its pattern. The salt ritual became a fixed part of the household rhythm. It was repeated not once, but endlessly, woven into the cycle of baptisms and starvation. The children knew when it was coming, knew the smell of salt carried in the bowl, knew the sound of the boards dragged across the floor. Fear hollowed them out long before the pain arrived. Their cries began early, small whimpers of dread, but Margaret silenced them with the promise that only through this would their souls be clean. In her eyes, their suffering was mercy and their scars were sacred marks. The cellar walls absorbed the echoes of those nights, the sound of infants thrashing against wood, the scrape of skin torn open, the muffled sobs when exhaustion claimed them. The boards themselves carried the stain of blood ground into salt, a permanent crust that never washed clean. Margaret often ran her hands across the surface afterward, as if feeling the residue of victory. She looked at the wounds she caused as a farmer looks at a harvest, proof that her labor bore fruit. What made it more chilling was her calmness. She did not rage or strike in anger. She carried out the ritual with the precision of a nurse, the serenity of a mother putting a child to bed. Her voice never lifted, her movements never faltered. To anyone who did not know the truth, Margaret seemed the picture of order and faith. But behind the closed doors of her cellar, her order was built on agony, her faith on flesh and salt. The children bore the scars long after the salt dried. Their skin blistered and hardened, leaving patches of rawness that healed crookedly, discolored and jagged. Every movement carried reminders of what had been pressed into them. They carried the marks into sleep, into silence, into whatever fragments of childhood they were allowed to keep. The scars became their inheritance, carved by the hands of the woman who should have protected them. Together, Margaret and Thomas perfected this ritual as though it were science. She brought the belief, the twisted theology that said pain was holy. He brought the discipline of record, the obsession with capturing every detail. What they created was not just punishment, but a system, a method of control that ensured no child could leave their hands without bearing visible proof of what had been done. The scars on their bodies became scripture, written not in ink or word, but in flesh itself. In the quiet after each ritual, when the children lay shivering and broken, Margaret prayed aloud. She thanked God for giving her the strength to fight corruption, for letting her strip evil from the skin of her own blood. Thomas closed his ledger with satisfaction, already preparing for the next entry. To them, these moments were victories. To the children, they were defeats that stole pieces of life they would never regain. And so the house grew darker, not in shadow, but in purpose. Every scream became part of its walls, every scar part of its memory. The rituals of salt and skin turned the Douglas home into a place where innocence was not nurtured but flayed away, leaving behind only the silence of children who no longer had strength to cry. What began as devotion deepened into doctrine, and what should have been love was replaced by a ritual that made pain the only language of purity. In the summer of 1826, when the fields were swollen with green and the roads dusted dry, Reverend Samuel Hale arrived at the Douglas homestead. He was a traveling preacher, a man who carried scripture beneath his arm and the weight of sin on his shoulders, stopping at scattered homes to bring words of comfort. To strangers, he was a guest welcomed with bread and water. But to the Douglases, he was something else, a witness they had not invited. From the moment he stepped across the threshold, Hale felt a heaviness that clung to the air. The house was orderly, too orderly, with everything in its place, as though touched by hands that feared a single object out of line. Margaret greeted him with a voice sweet enough to pass for kindness, her eyes downcast, her bonnet neat, her manner the model of modest faith. Thomas stood back, silent, his frame stiff, his face unreadable. To anyone else it would have seemed a humble household. Yet to Hale, who had walked through both pious homes and desperate ones, the quiet here was unnatural. The preacher noticed it first at supper. The table was full enough. Bread cut square, beans boiled, meat dried in strips. But there was no sound of children. Margaret explained that the little ones had been put to bed early, too weak from summer fevers to sit with them. Her voice carried no grief, only a calmness that unsettled him. He bowed his head for prayer, but even then he thought he heard the faintest creak beneath the floor, a sound not of the house settling, but of movement muffled, restrained. That night they offered him a cot in a small room near the back of the house. As he lay listening to the wind scrape against the shutters, another sound reached him. Soft whimpers rising through the floorboards, followed by the brief hush of a stifled cry. He sat up, heart heavy, straining in the dark. The noises came and went as though the earth itself was breathing pain. Hale pressed his palm to the wood beneath his cot and felt a tremor there, the faint vibration of life hidden under layers of silence. Unease gripped him, yet morning light dulled its edge. Over breakfast he asked about the children again, careful not to let his suspicion show. Margaret smiled with gentle sorrow, telling him of fevers that had taken infants too soon, of small graves dug on their land, unmarked but sanctified by prayer. Thomas brought out his ledger, flipping it open to neat entries of names, dates, and causes of death written in careful script. Hale studied the pages, finding them thorough, convincing in their detail. The order of the record seemed to leave no room for doubt. Still, something in his gut resisted the story. He walked the grounds that afternoon, noting the chapel beside the house, its beams weathered, its windows dark. The air near it was heavy with a smell he could not name, sweet and sour like rot buried too shallow. He paused, wondering if the graves lay there, but Margaret's voice called him back, warm and steady, and the thought drifted away like smoke. By the second night his unease had grown sharper. Again the whimpers rose through the floor, faint but insistent, the sound of children too weak to resist their own silence. He wanted to go down, to find the cellar and open its door, but he did not move. Fear rooted him in place, not fear of violence, but fear of what he might uncover. His faith told him to confront darkness, yet his human frailty begged him to leave it buried. In the morning he convinced himself that the sounds were dream-born, that his weary mind had mistaken wind and wood for voices. When he left the Douglas home, Margaret pressed a loaf of bread into his hands, and Thomas bowed with a quiet nod. They looked like a family devout and disciplined, their home a place of order. Reverend Hale carried his doubts but spoke none of them. He returned to his circuit of farms and cabins, offering scripture and prayer, leaving behind the memory of a house too silent, a house where something pressed against the floorboards, begging to be heard. His silence sealed the fate of those yet to come. The Douglases continued their rituals unchecked, their cellar echoing with cries no neighbor would ever hear, no preacher would ever confess. And so the visitor who suspected became part of the story, not by what he did, but by what he failed to do, proving once more that evil survives not only through those who commit it, but through those who choose to turn away. By 1830, the count of infants within the Douglas home had reached a number too heavy for chance. Yet no one outside its walls carried suspicion sharp enough to pierce the veil of godliness. 14 children had been born and baptized, their names whispered over bowls of ash water, their heads pressed against the wood of makeshift altars. 14 voices had once stirred the air of that house, and 14 voices had gone silent, one after the other. Neighbors believed fevers had swept them away, that frail bodies had withered under illness. They spoke of small graves tended in secrecy, trusting Margaret's quiet nods and Thomas's careful records. But in truth, no graves were dug, no earth split to hold their remains. The Douglas children were not buried in the ground. They were entombed in the very walls that were meant to shelter faith. The chapel beside the house, already a ruin of wood and stone, became their chosen crypt. Thomas and Margaret had hollowed sections of the beams, carving out cavities deep enough to hide what they called offerings. The work was slow, each incision measured with care. The sound of chisels muffled at night while the children still alive lay below in the cellar. Into these hollow chambers they placed the bodies of those who had finally succumbed, whether to starvation, suffocation, or the salt rituals. Margaret wrapped them as though dressing them for a final ceremony. Hymn pages torn from discarded books pressed against cold skin, the words of salvation pasted across rib and limb. Over these she spread lime, whitening the flesh, preserving it not from rot, but from discovery. To her this was not desecration, it was devotion, a way to keep them close to God rather than lost in the soil. Thomas approached it differently, his hand steady as he documented each placement. To him, the walls were not sacred but archival, each cavity a vessel of evidence, each corpse preserved as proof of his study. He noted how the bodies stiffened, how long it took before flesh yielded to lime, how paper clung to bone as moisture pulled the ink deep into the pores. His ledger carried lines that matched the walls themselves, diagrams of beams labeled with the initials of children, each one mapped as though the chapel was a living book, its pages sealed not with ink, but with bodies. He believed the structure itself had become his scripture, its frame built from suffering and record. The children who still lived in the cellar grew up in the shadow of those walls. Though they could not see the entombed, they felt their presence. The air carried the faint, sweet, sour odor of lime and decay that no prayer could disguise. At night, when the house creaked, it was not the sound of wood shifting, but of hollow beams answering the weight of silence within. The walls themselves seemed to breathe, their hollows whispering back the muffled voices of infants who had once cried there. For the living children, every sound became a reminder that their siblings had not gone to earth but had been sealed into the frame of their prison. Margaret told herself she was building a sanctuary, that by filling the chapel with the bodies of the baptized, she was creating a house of holiness too pure for outsiders to understand. When she knelt to pray in the nave, she placed her hands against the beams, feeling their hollows beneath her palms, whispering blessings into the wood. She believed the souls of the children were still near, clinging to the hymn pages, and that she had bound them forever to the house of God. Her faith had turned into possession, her children no longer her offspring, but relics, their bodies trophies of salvation won through pain. Thomas, by contrast, did not pray over the beams. He inspected them. He ran his hands across the seams, testing the strength of the wood, marking where cracks appeared, where moisture seeped. He was not preserving souls, but studying the durability of bodies under conditions he had created. The walls were his laboratory, and the silence of the entombed was his measure of success. He knew the neighbors suspected nothing, that their trust in ledgers and whispers of fever kept them blind. For him, secrecy was not a burden, but another variable, another way to measure how long cruelty could survive in plain sight. By the turn of that decade, the chapel no longer stood as a ruin of faith, but as a mausoleum disguised as devotion. To outsiders, its beams seemed worn but upright, its stones still steady. To those within, it groaned with the weight of its hidden occupants. The Douglases had transformed their sanctuary into something darker than death, a place where innocence was trapped in wood and lime, where no grave marked the passing and no mourners wept. The chapel was not abandoned. It was inhabited by silence, by the weight of 14 small bodies pressed into its frame, by the muffled cries that seemed to linger whenever the wind shifted through its rafters. And so the Douglas home stood unchanged, a place where baptism did not lead to burial, where every ritual ended not with rest in the earth, but with entombment in the walls. Margaret and Thomas saw no sin in it, only victory. The neighbors, comforted by lies of fever, asked no questions. The truth remained sealed within beams of wood, waiting for the day when time would finally splinter the structure and reveal what had been hidden. Until then, the chapel itself breathed with its own congregation, a congregation of the faceless, baptized but never buried. Time has a way of loosening secrets, even those hidden in wood and lime. By the 1870s, the Douglas name had faded into the past. The house stood empty, its shutters broken, its roof sagging with rot. The chapel beside it leaned like an old man near collapse, its beams swollen, its stones mottled with moss. No one prayed there anymore. Children dared one another to approach its door, whispering curses, while adults avoided it altogether. For decades it remained a husk of silence, a structure left to crumble into the earth. But silence does not last forever, and what the Douglases sealed would not stay buried. When the townsfolk finally decided to tear down the chapel, it was meant as a simple act of practicality. The land was needed, and the ruins too unstable to salvage. A group of workers gathered on a gray morning, armed with saws and mallets, their voices steady with the work ahead. They thought they were dismantling the shell of a forgotten church. They did not know they were about to split open a mausoleum. The first shock came when a beam was pried loose from the nave. As the wood cracked open, dust fell thick as ash, and from within rolled something too small and too round to be debris. A skull, fragile as porcelain, tumbled into the dirt. At first the men thought it was an animal, but as they gathered closer, their silence deepened. It was human, unmistakably human, and not the skull of a grown man or woman. It was the skull of a child. The more beams they opened, the more the truth revealed itself. Tiny skeletons slid from hollowed timbers, bones clattering softly against the earth, each one no larger than the length of an arm. Skulls bore narrow grooves along the sides, the imprint of leather straps that had once bound wooden masks to tender flesh. Some bones were wrapped in pages of psalms, the paper yellowed and brittle, stuck fast to ribs as if glued by decay. The words of salvation clung to the dead as though mocking them, their verses now unreadable but still pressed into the shapes of bodies. The workers recoiled, yet their duty forced them onward. With each beam torn down, more remains appeared. 14 small forms in total scattered through the chapel's frame, hidden in cavities carved with deliberate hands. The smell that rose from the wood was not the sharp scent of fresh death, but a faint, sickly sweetness, the lingering odor of long-preserved flesh. Even after decades, the lime had left its trace. It was as though the chapel itself exhaled, releasing what it had been forced to hold for so many silent years. Word spread quickly through the town. Families gathered at the site, horrified and hushed, staring at the pile of tiny bones laid upon the grass. What had once been spoken only in whispers, that the Douglas children were frail, that they had died young, that fevers had taken them, now stood exposed as a lie written in bone. The chapel that had once been built as a house of prayer had been turned into a crypt of cruelty, its very walls stuffed with innocence lost. Faith turned to horror in a single day. The discovery shook not only the ground where the chapel had stood, but the very memory of the community. People remembered Margaret's calm face, Thomas's quiet nods, the way the family had carried themselves as models of discipline. They remembered how no one had asked too many questions, how everyone had accepted the silence around the Douglas children. Now that silence seemed like complicity. What was meant to be a sanctuary was revealed to be a crime scene, each hymnal page a witness, each beam a coffin. The bones were gathered with trembling hands, laid side by side, though none could name them. No records told which child was which, only the cold ledger entries that had long since vanished or been burned. They were no longer sons or daughters, only fragments of a past too dark to bear. Some said prayers over them, others could not speak at all. For the first time in half a century, the voices of the Douglas children were heard. not in sound, but in the truth their remains carried. As the last of the chapel fell, the land itself seemed altered. The ground that had once held hymns now bore the weight of revelation, the uneasy knowledge that evil had lived not in shadowed strangers, but in the very people once held up as faithful. What had been hidden in silence was now laid bare, and though the Douglases were gone, their legacy seeped into every shaken heart. The chapel was gone, but the memory of what it held remained, carved not in wood, but in the minds of those who had seen the unearthing. The unearthing of the Douglas chapel spread through the county like a fever. At first the townspeople whispered, uncertain if the horror they had seen could even be spoken aloud, as though naming it might bring back the curse. But soon, whispers hardened into official reports and reports into action. The local authorities, pressed by outrage and shame, wrote laws to ensure such a crime could not hide again beneath Scripture. From then on, no child could be baptized without a registry of both birth and death, no funeral permitted without a marked grave. Each life was to be accounted for, each death tied to a resting place in the earth, not hidden behind wood and hymn pages. The Douglas children, robbed of identity in life, had forced a law that guaranteed it for those yet to come. Their suffering, though silenced in their time, reshaped the way a community measured the value of its youngest. Still, laws could not silence the unease. Some believed the Douglas home was cursed, that the land itself had absorbed the cries of those 14 lost souls, their voices lingering in the wind that moved through the broken fields. Farmers who passed after dusk said the beams of the dismantled chapel still groaned, even when carted away. Children dared not walk near the ruins, convinced that faceless figures waited for them there. Others refused to call it a curse at all, insisting that what had happened was not the work of spirits but of human hands and choices. Choices made in cold calculation, choices excused by silence. That silence became the weight no law could erase. For years, the community asked itself what it had failed to see. Neighbors remembered how quiet the Douglas children were, how they vanished one by one, yet no one questioned why no graves had been dug in sight. People recalled how Reverend Hale had once stayed with the family, how he later spoke vaguely of unease but pressed no further. They thought of Margaret's calm voice, Thomas's ledger, and their own willingness to accept the story of fevers without looking closer. The truth was that many had suspected something was wrong, but suspicion was easier to bury than to confront. The silence was not only within the Douglas home but across the whole valley, a silence of convenience that had cost children their lives. The lesson that lingered was simple but unbearable. Evil is not always loud. It does not always come with fire or with shouts or with the chaos of sudden violence. Sometimes it comes dressed in devotion, masked by order, spoken through Scripture. It works slowly, methodically, not rushing because it does not need to. It thrives not only in the actions of those who commit it, but in the eyes of those who look away, in the lips of those who choose not to speak. The Douglas family proved that the most dangerous evil is the one that wears the face of piety, because no one dares to challenge it until it is too late. In the years that followed, the Douglas home rotted into the ground. The land was cleared, planted again, rebuilt upon, but its history remained a scar no plow could erase. Generations grew up hearing fragments of the story, some treating it as legend, others as warning. Yet the unease persisted, that if one family could hide such horror behind a mask of faith, how many others had done the same, unseen, unchallenged, and undocumented. The Douglas case was remembered not just as a crime, but as a mirror, reflecting the cost of silence in any community willing to accept appearances over truth. When people passed the site, they did not speak of Margaret and Thomas as monsters alone. They spoke of themselves, of their grandparents, of those who lived beside evil and chose stillness over intervention. The question that remained was not only how the Douglases had done what they did, but how many others had chosen not to see, not to ask, not to believe the cries beneath the floorboards. The chapel may have been torn down, but its beams carried a message long after the bones were buried elsewhere. That evil, when it comes, does not always roar. More often it whispers patiently, calmly, until silence itself becomes its shield. The legacy of the Douglas family was not only the scars carved into the bodies of their children, but the laws written in response, the shame burned into the town, and the reflection forced upon all who learned of it. Evil had not struck in chaos, it had lived in order. It had thrived in stillness. It had been made possible by neighbors who wanted to believe the best of a family who looked like saints. And when the walls of the chapel finally cracked, the truth that seeped out was more devastating than fire. It was the proof that evil is most dangerous when it hides behind the face of the holy. And so the story closes not with the destruction of a family, but with a question that still lingers. Could it happen again? Could devotion mask cruelty? Could silence protect the unspeakable? Could faith be turned into a weapon against the innocent? The Douglas name may have vanished, but the lesson has not. Evil waits in silence, in method, in faces that appear righteous. The only defense against it is to see, to speak, to break the quiet before it becomes a grave.